felt far more revulsion against the community than I did against Lennox Sanderson. I figured, well, Lennox Sanderson is a hero. It was the community, these self-righteous prigs, these monstrosities of what is now known as the Judeo-Christian morality.
Even the people who to exaggerate.
Yeah, but what? She's a monstrosity also, the victim. See, she's not a victim because she's different.
You mean Hannah Moore?
She just happens.
Of course, because basically she accepts their morality. And,
Questions me.
She's woman, remember.
no, she's no, he's not. Ken is right to this extent. She is victimized by the community and by its morality. And to this extent, you go with it, you must go with it. But after it's all over, and by a hair, by a fluke, her life is saved, after it's over, this is the time at which she should have turned around and denounced the entire community for the barbarism and also the hypocrisy of its moral teachings.
But she never
And
questioned.
apparently she didn't learn anything from it.
But I think that Griffith does, by the way that he presents them, without making the story come out that way, they live in our minds as, you know, these creatures of horror, so that I don't find any contradiction between our view of how we feel about this sort of character in life and how we do feel about
You
it.
look at it, I feel that he slipped.
No, you know what? What Larry says is really fascinating. You know why? Because not only would Griffith turn his grave, and probably is turning it right now to complete the figure, but all the people of America whom the characters of Way Down East represent, they also would turn their graves if they knew or heard that they were considered as monstrosities of evil. They are supposed to be the innocents. They are supposed to represent virtue and charity and goodness, hard work, thrift, all the respectable virtues for which the United States fights one war after another.
Scriptures.
Faith, oh God, that above all, faith, you know, really, if you have any mind at all, you have even the mind of a pea, you have to take it out of it and dump it to the nearest waste basket to accept this faith in it. It's unbelievable, simply unbelievable. You know, the mother is represented, you know, the mother's a simple, good-natured moron. Oh, a kind of mental vegetable with a sweet disposition. Read it from the scriptures. And she finds something in the scriptures that tells the squire, you know, the scripture says this and says that. The squire doesn't even have the gumption to turn to another page of the scriptures and find the opposite that he can cancel her out. You know, he can very easily do it.
What is the title about that when she's introduced? There's something about, it says, you know, the mother who, and then there's something that makes fun of
some of these
Her soul is
sweet as the beloved Bible or something like that.
Yeah, but I mean, isn't that meant to be funny
Oh,
in the way
no!
that you take it?
Oh, God, no. Oh, no, I mean, this was,
No, she's the Christian. She's supposed to be the Christian in the movie. No.
Don't you think that Griffith understood that? No, that's what the story is about.
he was praised for his depiction.
The story is about Griffith.
Griffith would be understood if he was being ironic.
He was praised at the time for his understanding depictions of gentle people, and this showed that he himself was a gentle man. He depicts these people with love and fondness, and with a little touch of humor, and they do a little thing here, a little thing there, they're very nice. Listen, they are scoundrels of the worst kind.
We asked you talk to him about it. Did he like them? Did he like these people?
Look, I'll tell you a thing. If you want to know the truth about it, whenever you pinned Griffith down to anything, he was out the window. Look.
What do you mean?
Well,
Yes, I do.
no, because the trouble is, that all these conversations began, and when I first got to know him, and know him well, in 1924, this was already, remember, 11 years or 9 years, after the birth of the nation. And it was unfortunate, you know, when I was a kid, I didn't know him, and if I had known Griffith before the birth of the nation was made, I'm sure I would have learned much of great value. have no idea what the fight over the birth of the nation was like. I mean, this really split his career in half. I mean, and remember that this raged uninterruptedly, 24 hours around the clock for 3 solid years, and it was an ordeal to come through. And it was also the principal reason that he sought desperately to get some kind of a commitment or some kind of financing to make a film that would take him out of the United States. And of course he succeeded with the hearts of the world. But even before that, he went to London with intolerance for the British premiere. And he proudly and repeatedly in the years, in the decades that passed since then, referred to himself as the Lion of all London. And if you asked him, as I did, and as I'm sure other people did, I'm sure that Herb Stern asked him too, what he considered the really golden moment of his life, none of it referred to the United States. It was the British premiere of Intolerance when he was formally presented to the King and the Queen of England. And this is what stood out as the great moment of his existence. So if he could live his life over, he would have lived all of it as England. It was England and royalty and all this the United States where almost black people live.
Chaplain?
Oh. Well, Chaplin couldn't stand the United States for the opposite reason. Chaplin was always emotionally on the left.
But he still believed the aristocracy.
Right. He believed the aristocracy, and I'll tell you why, Canada. You ought to get out the door before I say it. You know, because I've got it in it hasn't come out in print yet, but I've got it in one of the chapters, you know, that if you want to be very sympathetic toward the victims of capitalism in particular, or for that matter, the victims of any social system, don't get close to them and don't get to know them personally. Then you can do a very good job championing their cause. See? Get close up. And you might decide to reappraise the hard hats.
No,
But the hard hats are victims too, in a sense.
that's it. It's not difficult. It's actually everything's simple. These people are deprived people, and they're degenerate people because they've been deprived.
Well, no, wait a minute, two sentences.
It doesn't-
No, two sentences can tell us when they stop, right there. These are
degenerate
degenerate people, period. That's one sentence. The second sentence is, they are degenerate people because they have been deprived. These are two separate thoughts. The second would carry us into many semesters that they're degenerate because they have been deprived.
Oh, I guess.
The fact is that we don't know.
Well, we see other examples where people have nothing, you know, in similar situations,
There's
and
one,
they
one
become,
cause.
they can become
One factor.
one of your mains.
That's because it isn't so simple. It's not so simple at all. I'm not sure why it is degenerate.
Well, no, all right, like in Russian films, they
Degenerate.
okay. In Russian films, you know, during a certain poster, movie period, they extol the peasants and they extol.
The peasant was represented like a Boy Scout. It was alive.
Of course, I'm
The peasant
saying.
was a drunken moujik. And we had absolutely no idea what the revolution was about. Couldn't care less. But you said, look, you can have a loaf of bread now. You didn't have it before that. You can understand. You know?
Yeah.
The blacks were more sophisticated. All they wanted was the right girls. They didn't even ask for bread.
Do you believe Griffith? What did Griffith say?
That's an avert.
That's
Well, I say, in comparison with the moujiks, with the peasants, and with the peasant, the proletariat, and the rising masses of revolutionary France in the 18th century, I would say that the blacks, in a sense, were more sophisticated. I mean, in other words, I'm using the three images. The image of the blacks is the more sophisticated. You see?
Oh, the rising masters. I don't think the Russian thing is the rising masters. I think that the stuff just falls away around them. And they seem to be rising.
Well, As far as I'm concerned, I would let it go at that, that for my money, as the saying goes, the villains, the real villains of way down east are the community and the morality that this community represents. And Leonard Sanderson is it actually is a story tale, a storyteller to promote the thing, you see.
But the reason was she could never turn around and ruin the movie, you know, he made her turn around and denounce the community, you know,
What are
because,
tremendous?
no, you see, because it's, she's part of the community.
She is, yes,
That's
she
the thing,
is.
she, you know, and if they, what they believed about her was true, you know, that she had, you know, been seduced and she had, you know, thought that she wasn't married. If they were right in thinking that about her, then she would be guilty, and she would think of herself as being, yes, really guilty, she does deserve to be thrown out, you know, on Christmas Eve.
Of course, that's very true, Peg, but there's one way, you know, that you could enjoy way down east. Like, for example, if they could resurrect the 35mm print, show it in the theater with the original musical score and so on, and you could enjoy it with the same kind of thrill that swept the audiences of 1920. There's one way. Accept the morality of the New England community and go along with it.
Right, but then you don't reject the gossip, because the gossip is, yeah, well, she's vicious, you know, and she's not trying to, but she's basically the morality is straight.
Oh, you bet.
So even Sanderson's all right.
I know, but in the scene that you talked about, when she's running through the thing, the close-ups of her face are really,
She's just being natural.
no, because only to a certain extent, because the very, on the most superficial level, you know, the story, you know, our sense that she caused all this trouble she's forgiven, but still the viciousness of what she did and the basic wrongness of what she did is not only made clear by just the most superficial story, but by her face. You know, I don't see her as being presented as, you know, like slightly comic on those close-ups that you were describing so well. You know, I really had to feel
The comic relief aspect is not in those scenes.
but that's where her real viciousness is really shown. That's not something that we're reading in.
Oh, you bet. You bet we're not reading it in. There's actual sadism in her face. But you know, it's too bad we don't, if you heard the Tchaikovsky piece, you know, the one, you know, it's sort of diabolically gay, but there's a sinister undercurrent to it.
It's the march of righteousness.
The which?
It's the march of righteousness.
Yes, yes, it
Righteous
is.
vengeance.
That's right.
Dispensing
So Griffith,
judgment.
you know, was it was like a Sunday Christian, right? Like he rejected this. You try to make like new chapters. Of
No, that is not true. No, he was not a Sunday Christian. But actually,
he lived this morality.
no, it isn't that. It isn't that because actually Griffith himself rejected the morality.
For himself.
That's right, he already sold that at the end.
He was great. He rejected the morality. This was the difficulty. That he knew all these people. These are the people among whom he was born and brought up. And he pitied them. He had a feeling of pity and kindness toward them. And I simply resent this because I cannot feel this way toward these people at all. In any group, any tribe, these are primitive tribes people. Their whole outlook on life is primitive and tribal, but it is the outlook of the United States government, for God's sake. It's the outlook of every state, of every municipality in the United States, in the Union. It's the law and the statute books.
He didn't deplore them. He didn't deplore their existence.
Well,
Savages.
whatever, if you can find any deploring way down east,
No, I don't.
well, that's it. I was going to say, if you found any, let me know. I don't see any. I wanted this, I expected this at the end. I didn't expect it in the course of it. It unfolded. It's very realistic, very convincing. But I did at the end. And there is none.
Just
And instead, there's the comic relief. It's almost as if he was saying to you, well, you see, they're not such bad people after all. They're kind of cute, aren't they? Aren't they quaint?
Right, they get
Quaint.
I think he's playing it both ways in the end. I still think that he's saying to the suckers out in the audience who are paying, you know, the $5 thing, they find it simply comic relief. But to the few people, you know, I think that there's the same just as he knew what he was doing in the scene with the gossip, in which all of her sadism and everything comes out.
You are right, and I'll tell you something. It reminds me too that long ago, at one of the performances, a performance of Wade Ellis that I attended, and this was in now this was not the 44th Street Theater, as I recall it. It was God. Yes, it was. I remember, because it was the first time I heard the word too. Some guy in the audience, about a dozen rows from where I was sitting, and jumped out of his seat. And one of the scenes, the music was blaring away and everything. He jumped up when the gossip was racing through the snow, and he yelled out, clear across the auditorium, "You goddamn bitch!" Like that. You know, I mean, you could see, maybe some man who had had experience, you see, maybe something that they might have. But the fact is that this character has the power to evoke that kind of hatred, you know. And I remember there was always excitement on the way down from one angle or another, and then the ushers came running, and a lot of murmuring, and it was curious because I think it was Variety that commented that we are back where we were when the Birth of the Nation appeared 5 years earlier, where people in the audience begin to get agitated and express resentment over one thing or another, you see. And the character of the gossip is very provocative through the years. I think the portrayal was tremendous. Oh, it was really tremendous. I mean, this was a great actress, Debbie Harper. Really great. You know that in later years, I met people who knew her and who never got over the performance, who never recognized her before. She was in life like Anna Moore. It was amazing. The other performance that we didn't mention, the other big one was by Emily Fitzroy.
Not in life, anyway.
That was Maria Poole. You know, she was an English actress. There was quite an assemblage in this film from the stage, by the way. Lowell Sherman, who played Lennox Sanderson, was one of the top Broadway actresses of the period, actors, I mean, of the period. He had been for at least a decade. A very high salaried actor, very much in demand in the United States and in England both. And so was Burr McIntosh, who played the Squire Bartlett. Very famous stage actor. But I think probably the greatest of the character actresses was Emily Fitzroy, the one who played the landlady in Dublin.
Tremendous.
Yes.
I had to keep her eyebrows raised.
Emily Fitzroy I met later on, and she looked exactly the same way. Looked and spoke exactly the way.
Yeah, the professor, by the way, joins up with the city. I mean, he's like from the city. I mean, he's as sexually idiotic as the rest of us.
Crazy Hale.
As his country.
That's a terrific phrase, sexually idiotic. I really mean
Sexually idiotic. Great, Harry. Great. Take that down. Sexually idiotic.
I'm a specialist.
I wanted to ask a question now, but not to get the answer now. So,
That's fine.
the question being that in speaking with Griffith all those times, he must have got a sense that you didn't agree with him. Promoting his films. I wonder what his response was. Don't tell me now.
Well, I don't know.
Tonight. Stop the tape.
Well, I don't know. I mean, we never commented. My own guess is it was probably a young boy, you know, and that I had to grow up to find out that way. Also, it was very hard to get Griffith to talk about any of his work, any of his Very difficult, extremely difficult. Okay. Yeah. Well, I just want to say that Ken and Flo Jacobs and myself were out looking for Anna lost in the storm. We were slightly delayed getting back, and we found her. She's in somewhere drying off. And while on the subject of Anna, someone asked me outside later on about the financial rating of Way Down East, because I had mentioned that it was the second biggest American film box office grosser or hit, the second after The Birth of a Nation. And I don't know that any final figures have ever been published for Way Down East. The bookkeeping records of that period being what they were, it was only a handful of the major film producing companies in Hollywood that kept any fairly complete books on intake and profits, and they all kept at least 2 sets of books so that the actual figures for them would never really be known either. But the published figures for Way Down East, which had cost production and all around, and that included the $175,000 purchase price for the rights to the play, had cost about $600,000. And at the end of the first year of its run, from September 1920 to September 1921, the gross intake was given by Variety as between $8 and $9 million. But here again, as in the case of The Birth of a Nation, these figures did not include the states' rights distributing records. These were freelance distributors, largely in the South, and they were accountable to no one. They made blanket deals, paid so much for the regional rights to commercial film distribution, and once the prints were turned over to them, what they got out of them, what they did with them was entirely their own business. But the official records as given out by the Griffith Company were between $8 and $9 million, and the releasing operation was then taken over by United Artists. United Artists was newly formed. Griffith, as I'm sure most of you know, was one of the founding members, and Way Down East was the first United Artists film, well, that is, I should say, the first film bearing a United Artists release banner. Then, but even there, United Artists came into the picture after the deals had already been set with states' rights organizations. Now, there was one more aspect of the question of Way Down East that I felt should have been mentioned, at least mentioned, if not explored. We all talked before dinner a great deal about the girl and about the cad, Lennox Sanderson, and about the community, the bigots and the gossips, the conservatives in general of the New England community, but nothing was said about the morality itself, the kind of morality that these people projected. And it's worth noting in passing because it runs in a consistent thread through thousands of motion pictures made in Hollywood from the earliest days of filmmaking. The thread now is broken. New concepts have finally reached the screen, but still in the type of film that until very recent years was commonly known as family pictures, family fare. This was the one single unbroken thread that the conservative morality or the Puritan Victorian morality was the only acceptable morality. And when a clergyman or a police officer or a political figure, a statesman, or when any conservative middle-class figure, in anyone in particular, anyone in general, made the statement that so-and-so has no morals, or this movie is immoral, or this book is immoral, or so-and-so is a person without any moral sense, and so forth and so on. I mean, you've all heard these cliches or read them thrown about. They're still being bandied about all over the United States. What these people really mean when they say that so-and-so has no morals, what they actually mean is that the person who is being denigrated does not have or does not share that particular morality, that particular form of morality. The statement that a person has no morals is utterly meaningless because every living being has a morality, even if the morality is the negation of all other morality. That in itself is a morality, a very elementary form of one, but it still is a morality. And to say that Joe Dokes down the block is a man without morals, what is actually meant is that Joe Dokes either does not observe or does not practice your morality. But Joe Dokes at that very moment is very likely busy practicing and observing his own morality. The habits, the mental habits, the mental reflexes of absolutism, whose roots go back thousands of years in the most primitive forms of religious thinking, are very deep-rooted and very widespread among the American people. And the terms are used as though they represented absolute, not only absolute and timeless, but universal values. And they represent nothing of the sort. There is a particular morality or code of morality that applies to this type of civilization and to related types of civilization in the old world, and there is another type of morality that applies to other civilizations. For example, I mean, if we have to really be childish about it, just for purposes of illustration, what is nowadays referred to as the Western world, and one political bigwig whom I met, if you will forgive me, of all places at the Chelsea Hotel about 3 years ago, objects to calling it the Western world, and says that it is improper to refer to Europe and the United States and Latin America as the Western world. He says it's the Christian world, not the Western world. It's the Christian. Well, I said, well, it's all right with me, but there are quite a number of persons living in the framework of that sub-universe who are not Christians, and what about them? And well, it doesn't matter. Why? Well, this fellow at least was no hypocrite. He was a very honest guy. He says it doesn't matter because they don't matter. Well, we were getting somewhere. This I like. You know, you can sit down and enjoy life. You can break bread with a man like that. You can really respect him. You say, well, it's fine, you know. And his contention was that that all that counted was the dominating or official morality and philosophical outlook, and that outlook, that morality, directly stemmed from Christianity and the beginnings of Christianity, and therefore Europe, South America, North America, and a few adjunct places collectively should be termed the Christian world. Well, I was very glad to accept that, and we proceeded from there, and I then asked him how he reckoned the world up to the time that what he called the Christian world, up to the time that it had not yet discovered Asia and most of Africa. That here was by far the larger part of the human race on the two largest continents, Asia and Africa, that were totally unknown to the Christian world until just a few hundred years ago, or certainly not before Marco Polo. And even the Marco Polo thing doesn't really rate, because it was just a breakthrough, an introduction, and there was still no contact. It was just a discovery. There was still no contact. I mean, the thing really didn't get underway until about 300 years back. And so here was the larger part of the human race that had been blissfully unaware all these thousands of years, all these hundreds of years anyway, blissfully unaware that, well, you know, that God had appeared here and had introduced the millennium, and all these hundreds of millions of blacks, browns, and yellows got cheated out of it. They didn't know a thing about it. And yeah, they really got shortchanged. They got shortchanged by time and history. And I asked him how, you know, how he accounted for that, and I said, by the way,